Welcome to the Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs podcast, a place for podcasters to learn what's actually working in the world of podcasting and how to use their podcast to generate consistent leads in their business. I'm your host, Jenny, and I'm so excited you're here. Hey, Savvies. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode with Laura Bowder, all about Clubhouse. We are both absolutely obsessed with that app. So I knew I had to bring an episode to the podcast about how we can use Clubhouse as a part of our podcasting strategy. So if you've listened to it yet already, let me know your thoughts. Head to Instagram and DM me. My handle is at Jenny Suneson. So Suneson. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that episode. But in today's episode, I'm going to be diving into how to select which social media channels you should use to grow your podcast. Because let's be real, unless you have some sort of social media presence or you're investing in paid advertising for your podcast, you won't be able to grow as quickly as you'd hope. The podcast players don't really promote the different shows unless you have a really big show already. And so they're not really helping us smaller creators get our show out there. So it's up to us to do so. So, yeah, that's what this episode is going to be about. But I do want to preface this with one thing. So, you do not need to be on every single social media platform to be successful with your podcast. Pick 2 or 3 max and put your all into those channels, because managing a million social media accounts will be so draining for you, especially if your podcast is just a small part of your business and isn't the whole focus. So, just wanted to get that out of the way because I think it's really important, because people always try to be everywhere. And when you're everywhere, it's just too much. You get burnt out, and we don't want that. So now let's chat about all the different platforms that you can be on as a podcaster. So first off, we're going to start with the traditional social media platforms. So to me, the traditional social media platforms are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. And while Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram have been around longer and more known than the other channels, I know TikTok used to be like Musically or something, and it hasn't been around as long as Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, I don't think. Definitely not Facebook. Yeah. So the reason I consider these to be traditional is because they're platforms that you can actually engage on and work to build a community around your podcast. A lot of the other quote unquote social media platforms that are lumped in here aren't really platforms you can engage on. So we'll kind of dive further into that in a little bit. So, first up, let's start with Facebook. So, I think personally having a Facebook page for your podcast is important, even if you don't plan on using it. So, you just create the page, don't really have to do anything with it, just set it up, get it looking nice so people can go over and like it if they decide to. Reserving the page isn't going to hurt you, and you can always have it auto post your episodes there without spending a ton of extra time. So, it's not one of those things that you have to let consume your life. There's also Facebook groups. I think Facebook groups are a great way to build community. I would definitely recommend investing your time in a Facebook group over a Facebook page if that's the route you decide to go. But yeah, Facebook groups are great to build community and get to engage with your listeners of your show. So if you already have a Facebook community and want to invite your podcast people to join, totally fine. It's not adding something new to your plate. But yeah, definitely a Facebook community group over a Facebook page. Next up, we have Twitter. So, personally, Twitter is actually probably one of my least favorite social media platforms, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work in some niches. I know tech is big on Twitter. There's so many people that still really use and love Twitter. It's just not for me, but it's not to say you can't use it. So if that's your platform of choice, rock it, use it. There's tons of people still on there. So definitely don't count it out if you think it would be beneficial for you. Next up, we have one of my favorites, Instagram. So, like I said, one of my favorites, and that's because it's just so versatile. There's the Instagram traditional feed, there is stories, there are Instagram reels, which is similar to TikTok, there are Instagram lives, and IGTV. There's like this thing called guides now. So there's a lot going on Instagram, which is why I love it so much, because basically any type of content that you could ever want is available, which makes it a great option to market your podcast on, since you can use, audio form with the episodes. You can use the video form with IGTVs and stories and reels and stuff. And then you can also use like written form with your captions on your feed posts. So instead of using Instagram and TikTok, you can just use Instagram and you get pretty much the same features while only having to worry about one platform instead of having to manage Instagram and TikTok. So I think that's why it's such a great option because it's just so versatile and there's so many things you can do with it. And you don't have to worry about managing both Instagram and TikTok or Instagram and something else. So, speaking of TikTok, that's what's up next. So, TikTok is a fun 60-second video platform. You can do less, but that is the max. So, I personally only use TikTok as a consumer at this point, but I think I'm going to start using it for my passion project podcast, which is going to launch in July. And while I don't have much experience using it for my podcast at this time, I know a ton of people who have had so much success driving people to their podcast from TikTok. So I think it's definitely worth a shot if your podcast demographic hangs out on TikTok and it's just somewhere you think you can really use to grow your podcast. Definitely don't count it out. Even if your audience is not Gen Zers or millennials, there are more like of the older generation on TikTok than you think. All right, next up, we have the last kind of traditional social media platform, and that is LinkedIn. So if your podcast caters more towards the corporate folk, then LinkedIn is probably a great option for you. It's not a platform I've really ever used in my business, only for when I was in the corporate world for a couple of years before I started my own business, but I've heard it works really well for certain podcast niches. So if you cater to those industry professionals, then I wouldn't count out LinkedIn by any means. So definitely keep that in mind if that is who your target audience is. So if you have a podcast about careers or like, I don't know, like upleveling your resume or stuff like that, that would be a great fit for LinkedIn. So I just wanted to quickly interrupt this episode to tell you a little bit about my 5 mistakes you're probably making with your podcast guide. So you may have been so eager to start your podcast that you totally forgot some of the crucial elements needed to have a successful and profitable podcast, but that's okay. The 5 mistake guide will help you get back on the right track. So if you want to grab that guide, you can head to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com/mistakes and grab that today. All right, back into the episode. So after the traditional social media platforms, there are social audio platforms like Clubhouse. I believe there's another one called Fireside, but I've only ever used Clubhouse. And you guys already know this is like my new obsession for the past few months. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode with Laura, definitely head there right after this episode because we do a deep dive into Clubhouse and how to use it to grow your podcast. But this is definitely a platform I use several times a week for myself personally and have certainly seen quite a bit of business growth from it and definitely made some new connections that I would never have had the opportunity to make without the app. So if you're not much of a video person and you're kind of obsessed with audio, which most of us are as podcasters, then you need to make Clubhouse one of your focused social media channels because it's so powerful and it's so great to make those connections. So, for me personally, when it comes to social media, the 2 platforms that I put the majority of my focus on right now are Instagram and Clubhouse for growing my podcast, for business in general. And like I said, I love Instagram because I can create all kinds of content to promote my episodes. And then with Clubhouse, it really just goes hand in hand with podcasting, in my opinion, because it has that audio component, but it's live. So you're able to build a community versus just talking at someone. You're actually able to have a conversation with them. Right now, I also have a Facebook page for my podcast, but I don't update it regularly because it's not something that I use as a consumer to keep up with my favorite podcast. So I feel like a lot of listeners of this podcast may be similar as well. Let me know if I'm wrong by DMing me on Instagram, but I don't think I am. And don't get me wrong, I do love Facebook groups and building community on Facebook, but in my opinion, pages are just not that beneficial when it comes to promoting your podcast. So, like I said, set it up, but don't make it your main platform unless you feel like you can really use it to build that community. So then we have the kind of outlier here, which is Pinterest. And people always tend to lump it into traditional social media platforms. But since it's more of a search engine than a social media platform, I'm going to put it in its own category. So it's what I like to call my personal bonus social media channel, since I really don't have to spend too much time on there because it's not really a social media platform. There's no really social aspect to it, but it really is beneficial for me as a podcaster since it drives traffic to my website and specifically my podcast episodes on my website. So if you have an audience of women and some men, then Pinterest might be a great place for you to check out for driving people to your podcast. It's not just moms and baking and recipes and cleaning hacks and home decor anymore. It is so much more than that. There are, my podcast is about podcasting and I get a ton of hits to my episodes from Pinterest. So definitely don't count it out. Definitely give it a shot because you don't really have to worry about that social aspect of it. You just have to worry about creating great graphics that lead back to your episodes and you'll be golden. So I'm just curious, what channel or channels are you currently using to grow your podcast, or do you plan to use to grow your podcast if you haven't started yet? And if you're still lost on what social media platforms you should use for your podcast, like specifically, you can tell me the name of your podcast and, what it's about, and we can figure out what channels are going to best serve you. I'd love to chat with you about it. Feel free to DM me on Instagram. Like I said, my handle is at Jenny SUNESON, and let's chat about it. Let's figure out what channels will be the best fit for you so that you can grow your podcast like a rock star. So that is it for this quick episode. You can find the show notes for this episode by going to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com. And I will see you guys in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher, and leave a review. You can find us at savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com and on Facebook at Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs and Instagram at Savvy Podcasting. Make sure to join our free Facebook community for podcasters by going to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com/community and join in on the exclusive community just for Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs listeners. I'll see you there.